Welcome to week 7, video 2 of our Principles of Microeconomics video series. In previous videos, we've looked at how buyers and sellers behave in competitive markets. Check out those videos at the link above. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to think about how all of this self-interested, rational behavior with buyers and sellers interacting in competitive markets in a long-run competitive equilibrium situation serves our society and solves our economic problem. How to allocate and use scarce economic resources as efficiently as we can as a society to bring the greatest good to the greatest many. Let's get to it. In our last few videos, just to remind you, we focused on the supply relationship and we figured out that in the short run, as long as the price exceeds the average variable cost of production, the firm can stay in business. In the short run, if the price does not exceed average variable cost, then the firm should do a shutdown, a temporary closure until market conditions might change. But in the long run, the price has to exceed the average total cost. But the key here is that in the long run, everything is flexible. And so you might be able to change everything about your production, the location, the technology, the process, and all these things. So in the long run, your costs are not fixed. They can change and your production process can change. And they're going to change in a way that responds to the competitive market pressures. If firms are entering your market because you're making profits, the price you receive for the good is going to fall, meaning your profits are going to fall. And so you're going to have to make adjustments. You're going to constantly have to be looking for that edge. And what that does is that it helps consumers. Let's illustrate this using an example. On the screen, I've got the various levels of production and the various factory sizes that a firm could choose in the long run. In the short run, they might be stuck at a small factory, but in the long run, they could move to a medium factory, they could stay at the small factory, or they could even go to a large factory. Naturally, because these factories are all different sizes and perhaps in different locations, and they have different workers and different jurisdictions with different prices and costs of labor, all that kind of stuff. The costs of running each factory are quite different. And in particular, at the small factory, the costs are low when you want to produce a small amount, but they increase rapidly. The large factory, the costs are high regardless of your level of production, but they don't increase as fast as you produce more and more. The medium factory is more like a in-between option. The costs are higher than the small factory for lower levels of production, but smaller than the large factory for lower levels of production. So if we divide each of these total costs by the level of output, what we can do is we can get an average total cost for producing at each type of firm. And I'm going to plot these on a graph. The small firm has an average total cost in blue, as you can see. The medium factory has a green average total cost curve, as you can see. And the larger firm we're going to plot in yellow. What you need to figure out from this is what would be the long run average total cost. The key thing here is that the firm can switch between each different type of factory in the long run. In the table, I've got kind of the solution, right? I've picked out in the long run which factory has the lower cost of producing the given quantity of the product. And for the first two levels of production, the small factory is best. For the last two levels of production, the large factory is the cheapest option. And at an output level of 200, the medium factory is the best option. So what does that mean? It means that the long run average total cost is going to be the black line that lies beneath the lowest points on the small factory, medium factory, and large factory average total cost curves. And so in the long run, the average total cost is always going to be the smallest from each of these options. And that's fantastic for consumers. What it means is that in the long run, the firm is going to produce where it's the most economic to do so. It's going to produce where its costs are lower, so the marginal cost is lower. That means that at any given price, the firm can produce more in the long run because they can switch factories than they would in the short run, because they can make a better choice. So your marginal costs are going to be low, which means your supply curve is going to be way out to the right, and that supply curve is going to be as big as possible because the supply curve in the long run requires that the price exceeds average total cost. And so the marginal cost curve becomes the supply curve for the firm at any price above the long run average total cost. And because that average total cost is as low as possible, and because the marginal cost curve is as small as possible, the costs are as low as possible, it means that at any given price in the long run, the firm is going to produce more units of the good at a lower cost to our society. Speaking of long run supply, we need to actually talk about the concept of producer surplus in this video too. And producer surplus is just the difference between what a seller is receiving for their good, the price they can sell it at, and how much they're willing to sell for or willing to accept for the good. Graphically, it just looks like the difference between the price that they receive and the supply curve, the marginal cost of producing, because our assumption is that if the marginal cost is 5 and you're offered anything more than 5, you'd be willing to sell. So your willingness to sell is at $5. If you can sell for $10, you get a producer surplus of $10. And in a market situation where we graph the market supply curve, well, there's one firm willing to produce the first unit at the lowest marginal cost. Then there's a market price. And the difference between the price and the willingness to sell, if you draw in a rectangle centered at that first unit of the good with a base of 1 and a height equal to the difference between the price of the good and the willingness to sell, you're going to be able to plot the producer surplus from that first unit of the good. Then you can add the second unit of the good, do the same thing, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, the ninth, the 10th, the 11th, and so on and so forth. Well, when you look at a graph like that, the rectangles, when they're all stacked close together like that, begin to resemble a triangle. Again, like when we did consumer surplus. You can calculate producer surplus, again by implementing the formula for the area of a triangle. And in this case, the height of the triangle goes from 0 all the way up to $3, the price. So that's the height. And the base, because we're measuring everything in hundreds, is 1,200. And so you multiply 1/2 times $3 times 1,200 for a producer surplus of $1,800. Now that we know how to define producer surplus and consumer surplus, we can consider social surplus, the social surplus from a market. The consumer surplus plus the producer surplus added together is what makes up the social surplus. It's a measure of how well consumers and producers are doing in a market situation. In the figure on screen, I've got the supply curve and the demand curve, and I've got prices and quantities at equilibrium. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the whiteboard and work out the consumer and producer surplus, then add them together and call that social surplus. So what I've done here is I've already drawn the demand and supply curves and the information in the question. And what we're going to do is we're going to work out consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is going to be equal to 1/2 times the base of the consumer surplus triangle. Well, the consumer surplus triangle is the shape that lies between the demand curve and the price line and the vertical axis. So it's going to be 1/2 times that base here. And that base corresponds to this distance from 0 all the way out to 250. Because if this line is 250, then this line is 250. So 1/2 times 250, which is the base, times the perpendicular height, and in this case it goes from 25 to 15. 25 minus 15 is equal to 10, so it's 10. When you multiply that out, you'll get $125. So the consumer surplus in this case is equal to $125 at a price of $15. For the producer surplus, well, it's going to be a triangle between the supply curve and the price line. And remember, this is the long run supply curve. So this supply curve is from a competitive market, and that competitive market features a supply curve, a long run supply curve that's producing as much as possible at the market prices. And that long run supply curve is the one that gives us the biggest level of production for any given market price, along with the lowest possible use of our resources. It's the one that has the lowest costs and the most production, which is wonderful for consumers and for our society more broadly. And so what is the producer surplus? Well, the producer surplus is going to be equal to 1/2 the base, and again, the base here is the same as the base of the consumer surplus triangle, 250, times the perpendicular height. And in this case, it's 15 minus 4, that's the height here. So you get 1/2 times 250 times 11, and that will give you 2750 divided by 2, which should be equal to 1,375. And I just noticed that the consumer surplus is not 125, it's 1250. I forgot a 0. So now we have the producer and the consumer surplus. If we add them together, we're going to get social surplus, 1375 plus 1250. That gives us a total social surplus of 2625, if I've done my math correctly. And my claim to you is that this is the largest you can get. This is the best outcome that you can have. And while this isn't a very accurate graph, I'm going to illustrate that it's the best outcome by just thinking about having a different price. What kind of price can you have? Well, the price could be, say, $10. as we mark in there? Well, if we go across from 10, we're going to get a new supply, which will be lower than 250, maybe just 200. And because there's only 200, we're going to get a lower consumer surplus. We're going to get a lower quantity consumed by consumers. There's only 200 available, so there's only going to be 200. And okay, some people get them for $10, but now the consumer surplus is going to be the area above the demand curve and above the price. So it's going to be made up of a weird triangle and a rectangular shape. And that rectangle is this rectangular shape here, plus a triangle up here. That's going to be consumer surplus. And the producer surplus is going to be the smaller area down here above the supply curve but below the price. So relative to a world where we've got $2,625 of consumer and producer surplus, we're going to have less social surplus when we manipulate the price to be something other than the market price. And how can you see that? Well, in the graph, you'll notice that there's an area here consisting of what used to be some social surplus. And it's not part of the new consumer surplus at a price of 10, and it's not part of the new producer surplus at a price of 10. It's just gone. And if you look at it and think about it carefully, it corresponds to the lost consumer surplus and producer surplus, the lost consumer surplus and the lost producer surplus, from the 201st, 202nd, and all the way up to the 250th unit of the good. Those 50 units that we used to get at the original market equilibrium, they were goods that brought value to people. They were goods for which people were willing to pay and people were willing to produce and sell at the market price. So naturally, because we've lost those transactions, we've lost some social surplus. We've lost some of the benefits that markets can bring us as a society. This area has a special name. It is the deadweight loss. And you'll see that if you put the price higher than the market price, you'll get a similar area of deadweight loss. And that deadweight loss corresponds just to the lost consumer and producer surplus from having a price other than the market price. Okay, that's enough for this video. And in this video, what we've done is we've looked at the long run competitive market equilibrium and how that long run with the pressures from consumers and from competitors affects the long run average total cost and the long run supply curve for a firm. And we figured out that in the long run, the average costs are as low as possible and the supply is as large as possible at any particular price. Then we introduced the concept of producer surplus, and we put producer and consumer surplus together to determine social surplus. As part of that exercise, we studied what would happen to the market surplus or the social surplus if the price was anything other than the market equilibrium price. And we found that when there is a price that's not the same as the market equilibrium price, there's going to be what's called deadweight loss. Next week, we're going to return to these topics. And what we're going to do is we're going to reflect on everything we've learned so far and put it into the context of the philosophical problem that Adam Smith was trying to figure out. How can a society that consists of people who are mostly self-interested but rational people, how can they arrange themselves in a way that best serves our society without being guided by a benevolent overlord? I'll see you in the next video.